So we're going to talk about concrete and related greenhouse gas policy today. This is something actually that, believe it or not, I got interested in because Richard made me do it a couple of years ago. He was looking for somebody to do really to help him out, and I was reluctant, of course, but he suggested a few topics, and this was one that sort of it was a little interesting to me. I learned a whole bunch about it at the time, and as a result of learning about it, I was introduced to a guy at UW, University of Wisconsin in Madison, who's working on this project, on this problem. And he and a colleague of his in the civil engineering department have developed a process that they are trying to commercialize right now. And I really, as a result of this interaction with this subject, I got really very interested in. I started talking to him about it. I told him that I'm not the person to help him out with anything technically oriented, but that I work with Citizens Climate Lobby, and policy-wise, might be able to help further the cause. And so actually over the last couple of years, I interacted with him quite a bit and became even more knowledgeable about the subject. So really, the responsibility for this is on Richard's shoulders. So with that having been said, let's keep moving. So I had put together a presentation really for this group literally a couple of years ago, and I had assembled quite a few of the slides that I'm going to review again because I think they're even more important to understand, and I find them really interesting, in particular as I have learned more and I understand more about really what I put together a couple of years ago. So it turns out that concrete, you see it right here, is responsible for roughly 8% of worldwide carbon dioxide emissions annually. And those emissions are a result of really, I'll say two things. One is all the energy that is used to move materials around, the gasoline or diesel fuel or whatever that you put into trucks to, move it from place to place, including the aggregate that you have to, blast down of quarries and that sort of thing. And then the energy, and then the production of lime from limestone. So in making lime, you start with limestone, which is calcium carbonate. Maybe I have that here. Let's see. Now let's start with this. So first of all, what is concrete?
Could I make a little point? I won't do this very often, Doug.
Sure.
If you go back to your last slide, I would like to just make the point that the blue sectors there, electricity and transportation, are supposed to be the low-hanging fruit. And we've been talking about this in this class for a good 10 years. And it turns out the low-hanging fruit has not done very well. And so I would pose that given that fact that concrete might very well play an even larger role than 8% if you view the inefficiency with which we've dealt with those blue sectors. Comment done, but it's just a suggestion.
Okay, I'll think about that. I'm not sure that I can comment on it right now.
Okay.
But you're right. At least so far, we've certainly tried to address the electricity sector, the transportation sector. Actually, we're doing something now about commercial and residential. We talked about heat pumps a few minutes ago. Industry has actually attacked this as well. So we're going to talk about the production of lime here in a minute, but it turns out that actually smelting of steel suffers from very similar issues, and it's being addressed as well using, I know that hydrogen is one of the components of solving that issue within the steel industry, as well as recycling steel and that sort of things, recycling steel as well as aluminum. So first of all, what is concrete? So it's everybody, I think most people, if not everybody, is familiar with it. And it's a mixture of broken stone or gravel with sand, cement, which is largely responsible for the carbon dioxide emissions, and then water. And it can be spread or poured into molds that forms a mass resembling stone on hardening. It's very convenient because it can be formed into all kinds of shapes for support. And that's, I think everybody, certainly after thinking about it, realizes that that's probably why it's used so much. And cement itself is the binder. So we see in concrete, we see various sizes of aggregate in the concrete. It could be larger stones, or it could be small pebbles. Depends on what you're using the concrete for. And that cement actually surrounds the aggregate and then sets up and hardens, and it adheres to the other materials to bind them together. So it's a binding agent, the cement in it. So I'm going to get into the chemistry. And I want to get into the chemistry because it actually highlights some of the solutions. And I particularly find it interesting, in particular, now that I understand it better than I used to. So it actually looks really complicated, but it's not necessarily as complicated as you would otherwise think. So you start out with this calcium carbonate, which is limestone. I think we've all heard of limestone. I guess I never knew that it was actually calcium carbonate until I got involved in this. And what you do with it is you put it into a kiln at very high temperature, and that process drives off carbon dioxide, CO2, and leaves you with lime, calcium oxide. Okay, so this is a process that, first of all, you can see it right there. It drives off a whole bunch of carbon dioxide, and in doing that, we're creating a climate issue. In addition to that, though, you have to raise this to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit to accomplish this reaction. So it takes a lot of energy to get up to that temperature. And roughly speaking, about half of the CO2 that's emitted in this process is emitted directly from the limestone, and about half of it comes from the energy that you have to supply, usually in the form of coal or something like that. That you're heating this in a kiln, so you're burning something to get the kiln up to temperature. And then, in addition to that, this is the process to make what's called ordinary Portland cement, or they call it OPC for short. I'll just call it Portland cement because that kind of rolls off my tongue. But essentially, you're adding to it sand, silicon dioxide. And they actually make both the the lime and this silica that they add in here. The silica, you'll see alumina in here, this Al2O3, and this ferric oxide, Fe2O3. It's all added at one time in this kiln. And actually the calcium component comes from limestone. The silica, the alumina, and the iron come from usually clay sources. Okay, so clay typically contains these other three elements. And in fact, one of the things that I've learned, really arguably as a result of all this, because I got interested in it, I took a course in what's it called? Geological chemistry a couple of semesters ago. And it turns out that silica is, I believe, it makes up somewhere in the neighborhood of, I'm going to say it's like 50% of the mass of the Earth's crust. So there's a lot of silica around in the world. And so in clays, you find this silica and alumina and iron, obviously. And you mix all this together in this kiln, and the CO2 is driven off, and you end up with what's called clinker. So this the clinker comes out in chunks. It comes out of the kiln in chunks, and then it's ground into a sort of a fine powder. And that's what you can buy in bags of Portland cement. And many of you, if not everybody, has used Portland cement at one point in time in your life, or seen it at least. The calcium oxide then can be mixed with water. And when you do that, you end up with calcium hydroxide. It's called slaked lime. That's the term that's used for it. I'm not sure why it's called slaked lime. I haven't looked that up yet. But it turns out then, if you take a look at the last line of this, if you add CO2 to calcium hydroxide, you end up getting calcium carbonate back with water. That's kind of interesting because you're going to see in this chemistry that that's one of the ways of resolving one of these problems.
Yeah, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
Probably going to get to this, Doug, but yeah, that last equation is what direct air capture plants do, and then they do this over trays with lots of big fans.
Yep.
So this last equation is where they start, and then once that material is, the calcium carbonate is fully formed, then they go to the top equation and then heat it up and release it and then capture it and put it somewhere. I don't know how, but maybe you're going to cover that. I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. But
Okay.
the interesting thing here is that this is a complete cycle here. Okay, we created a problem at the top, and we're solving the problem sort of at the bottom. Okay. And that's really what I wanted to point out in the chemistry.
Yeah.
And it turns out, and you can kind of think about it this way, there's a lot of heat that's released when you, the reaction, the preferred direction of the reaction is this last reaction. And that's why it takes so much heat to separate the carbon dioxide from the calcium oxide. Okay, so this last reaction is the one that's actually preferred thermodynamically. Okay, so this is the Portland cement composition. So when you do this in a kiln, first of all, I want to point out some nomenclature here, because I know for anybody who ever learned chemistry, C usually refers to carbon and S usually refers to sulfur. And I guess in civil engineering, they decided they didn't care about that. And so they shortcut this whole thing, and C refers to calcium and S refers to silica or silicon. Okay. So you'll see this nomenclature a lot of times, and I just want to kind of warn you about that because I know I've talked to other chemical engineering friends of mine, and they got really kind of sideways with this and criticized it. And I said, well, you just have to get used to it. And it's sort of like learning another language, you just kind of roll with it after a while. Okay, so one of the most important components that's produced in this kiln is this tricalcium silicate. Ultimately, it will really contribute most of the strength of concrete or of cement. Okay, and then there's a sort of a similar output, dicalcium silicate. So there's a tri and the di versions of this. And I'm going to talk about these contributions in a second. Then the tricalcium aluminate, and then this aluminoferrite, and then gypsum. Okay, and gypsum, well, I think we're all familiar with it because we probably a lot of us have wallboard in our homes, and this is what wallboard is made out of, gypsum. So it's calcium sulfate. And so, what do these do? What do these things contribute to the concrete? The reason I'm mentioning this is because these are some of the challenges that are presented to us when we have to replace this Portland cement. We have to come up with some of the same properties that Portland cement confers to concrete. So when tricalcium silicate, when it gets hydrated, when you add water to it, it creates strength and volume stability. Okay, so it will harden and it will become fixed in space, which lends strength to any structure that you make with this tricalcium silicate. The dicalcium silicate, it actually reacts more slowly. And one of the things that certainly I've learned more about with respect to concrete, and I think we've all seen it, is when it's poured, a lot of times you're told to stay off of it for long periods of time. And it actually, it sets up relatively quickly and sometimes too quickly. If you've ever worked with it, sometimes you want it to set up a little more slowly so you can work with it a little bit longer. But over time, it gains strength. And it gains strength because this dicalcium silicate is reacting in the sort of in the solid mass, and it actually reacts with, I think, other dicalcium silicate and other silicates that are in the mixture. Okay, even in this what I would then describe as a solid mixture. Okay, so these bonds are still being formed, but they're being formed more slowly, and over literally weeks and months, this dicalcium silicate continues to react to strengthen the concrete that's produced. Okay. Then we get down to this tricalcium aluminate. Okay, so it's extremely reactive, and it's actually the very first thing that reacts when you add water to cement, to Portland cement. And it generates quite a bit of heat. And, as anybody who's ever, I guess, studied chemistry knows that generally speaking, reactions proceed much more quickly as the temperature rises. In fact, I think it's roughly a factor of 10 for every 10 degrees centigrade or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the relationship is, but it's the Arrhenius reaction kinetics that are involved here. And so when this tricalcium aluminate reacts, it actually forms some fibrous material, but most importantly, it generates a lot of heat, and it generates some early strength. And early strength is one of the things that, in particular, if you talk to public works people, they're looking for. Let's say you're pouring a sidewalk or something like that. Well, it's kind of difficult to keep the dogs and the cats off of the sidewalk. And so you want it to harden sufficiently to avoid paw prints in your concrete. Okay, and so this is one of the properties that you're looking for with concrete. Something that we'll have to duplicate. And so you see this tetracalcium aluminoferrite, likewise, high early strength and durability to sulfate attack. Okay. The last thing in here is gypsum. Okay, so gypsum actually slows down some of these reactions. And so a lot of times it's added to cement to slow down the curing process. Okay. That's so you can work with the cement longer. You can imagine you're pouring something really big and you're needed to spread out and to form it properly. So there's a blend of this that's made that meets the requirements of really any application, I think. So I just wanted to get you, so you have a kind of a feel for some of the things that are at play here. Okay, so here's a typical composition. 60% range for calcium oxide or lime. About 20% silicon dioxide, 2.5 to 6% of aluminum oxide. Remember, it accelerates hardening, gives you a little bit of early strength. Likewise, 0 to 6% of ferric oxide, and then you have a little bit of this sulfur in there. Okay, and the sulfur will slow things down. It's used to moderate how quickly hardening occurs. Okay, and this is a description of actually what happens when you add water to this cement. Here's kind of what happens in sequence. So the first thing that happens is this tricalcium aluminate and gypsum and water react together, and it forms these crystals that are only stable in a solution with gypsum, and it does not contribute any strength to the cement. Okay, but what it does do, you can see the amount of heat that it releases. So it releases a fair amount of heat or energy per gram of reactants. The next thing that happens is you get this tricalcium silicate. It gets hydrated. Okay, and notice in here that when you hydrate this tricalcium silicate, remember the notation here where the C reflects calcium, S is silica, H is water. Okay, so you're hydrating this stuff, and you end up generating calcium hydroxide. So you start off with in the 1 to in the Portland cement, you have calcium hydroxide. So when you put water in there, you're going to be forming calcium hydroxide simply by the mixing of calcium oxide with water. You're going to be forming calcium hydroxide. But in addition to that, this tricalcium silicate is also going to generate even more calcium hydroxide. Okay. And it turns out that this base, this calcium hydroxide base, is one of the things that's catalyzing the sort of the polymerization of this calcium silicate material. Okay, and it's that polymerization, that creates the glue that holds all of this concrete together. Okay. And notice also the amount of heat released. So it's roughly speaking, it's half of what's released with this tricalcium aluminate. Okay, so this reaction, this second reaction, is going to proceed soon after this attringite is created. Okay, so this is the last one that I think is important, and it's kind of interesting as well. So the tricalcium aluminate, we talked about it. Its first reaction that occurs, it forms these monosulfate crystals, and you can read like I can. They're only stable in a sulfate deficient solution. So in the presence of sulfates, the crystals will resort back to attringite. So as soon as the gypsum is used up, these the attringite starts to disappear. Okay, it sort of dissociates, and that's a good thing, because that attringite is a fairly large structure, and so you purposely don't put a whole lot of sulfate or gypsum in the Portland cement, so that it gets used up. But if subsequent to that, somehow the concrete is exposed to sulfates, that actually causes this attringite to reform within the concrete itself. And those crystals, as it says here, are 2.5 times the size of the monosulfate. And it's this increase in size that can cause cracking when cement is subject to sulfate attack. Okay, so we all see, and I've always been told that concrete always cracks. There's no avoiding it. It'll always crack. And this is one of the reasons for it. Okay, so this is this calcium silicate, which gets hydrated, and you can see that it will form more calcium silicate hydrate and more lime. Okay, more calcium oxide. Okay, and remember what we talked about earlier, that when you form this lime, if you mix it with more water, you get calcium hydroxide. If you expose that calcium hydroxide to CO2, it will absorb and react with CO2 to form calcium carbonate again at lower temperatures. Okay, and this is the reaction that ultimately causes concrete to become stronger and stronger as time goes on. So you'll see that the compressive strength of concrete will get quite high over a period of a month. And that's why when you look at these buildings around that are, being built right now, you'll see a lot of supporting structure in place literally for a month to allow that concrete to gain the strength that it was originally designed to have. Okay. There are some other reactions that take place. I'm not going to get too down into this, but I wanted to make sure that you see some of it, and some of the properties that are important ultimately in concrete. In particular, I want to highlight again the importance of early strength. That's one of them. Okay, and early strength is needed in warm and cold conditions. So actually obtaining that in cold conditions is a little more difficult because the reactions are slower. Finally, you'll see this voids down here at the bottom. So voids actually allow, among other things, it allows water ultimately to get into concrete. And you know that water that then freezes will exert internal pressure to the concrete and also cause cracking. So these voids many times are not desirable. And as a reason, to avoid that, no pun intended, sometimes you use certainly a distribution of size, rock and pebbles and that sort of thing in the aggregate that's added. But you might also use a very fine grains material as well. And so some of the solutions to this involve actually grinding things down to very, very fine particle sizes. Okay, so one of the important elements of this is that this alkali and a base, or calcium hydroxide, is considered to be caustic. It's considered to be an alkali. It's actually what activates Portland cement to harden. Okay, it actually catalyzes that reaction and is involved in that reaction. And so to the extent that you can find other materials that have these same minerals in them, then you can substitute these other materials for the clay or the clinker that is used in Portland cement. Okay, and so that's one of the strategies that we're going to talk about here. Let's see if I can get past this again. Okay, so I know that I know that many of the alternative solutions point at using this particular strategy, activating them using an alkali, and so we're going to talk about that. But then some of these materials are also subject to sulfur attacks. So imagine now you use some material that has a lot of alumina in it. Well, that actually exposes that material to a sulfur attack that will result in cracking. So there have to be, in addition to substituting alternative raw materials, there are often ways of adding including other additives to avoid these other reactions. Okay. Okay, so what's used as an alternative in some cases, and I mentioned this earlier, that that in addition to adding limestone to this kiln, you add clay or some clay-like material, and these materials are you know, I guess they're fairly abundant and available, you know, from various I don't know, you know, it says here large in the EU, they say there's 7,000 large reservoirs from dredging, for example. Okay, so we were actually just riding our bikes through the Netherlands, and I can tell you that they're always dredging the canals there. So I would imagine that a lot of this stuff comes from something like that. But in addition to that, another source of a geopolymer, effectively a geopolymer, is fly ash. And fly ash likewise contains all of these minerals. And it turns out that this is something that's been known for years and years. And fly ash is actually a very common component of concrete today, and has been literally for years, and mainly because it's abundant and it's cheap. Public or electric utilities have had to do something with it for years, and one of the things that they can do with it is included in concrete. And I think I've shown this slide before. This is the ternary diagram for silica, calcium oxide or lime, and alumina. Okay, and all of the different I'll call them crystal structures that occur depending on the amounts of these three components in your mixture. And it's this gray area here where Portland cement is normally designed to reside, somewhere right in here. But in principle, you could get something from any place in here and potentially use it as a substitute. So with that as a backdrop, and as I said, I wanted to go through this chemistry to start with. I wanted to kind of to switch to, you know, what are we going to do about this? And so I have to tell you that, as I said, I got really interested in this, and then I started really talking with a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And I told him that I really didn't know that I could help him, and he didn't need any help technically, but that I could possibly help with policy. And policy then would drive the interest in these alternative materials, one of which he and his colleague are getting in business to produce. So I started, you know, talking to various people inside and outside of Citizens Climate Lobby, and I ran into a woman who, from really from the outside, you would never guess in a million years that she's accomplished what she has. But she is a Girl Scout troop leader. But in addition to that, she's actually a very well-trained, really arguably a business person. She happens to be mom to 4 little girls, I think, who range in age from something like, oh, I don't know, at the time, probably 6 to 14. And now they're much older. I think they're a few years older than that now. But they were all in the Girl Scouts. And during COVID, they were looking for something important to do. And they decided as a group that they were going to try to have an impact on what's called embodied carbon. And embodied carbon is the essentially it's the carbon dioxide that has been emitted in really producing any product. It could be the pen you use to write with, the automobile you drive around, could be the paint on your wall, could be a rug you walk on, but everything that I won't say absolutely everything, but probably almost everything that we use has some amount of energy effectively embodied in having been produced. And many times that energy has resulted in carbon dioxide being emitted to the atmosphere. And so this Girl Scout troop got interested in pursuing solutions to that. And in an effort to really educate people about it, they produced several videos. And I'm going to show you one of them. They've actually produced several that are longer than this. But this one in particular, this one was shown at a national, I'm going to say it was a national concrete convention out in San Francisco. Now this Girl Scout troop is here in Madison, and they've actually become somewhat famous among concrete producers because of this. And I'm going to see if I can get this to open up. So hold on. Let's see if I can get this to go. I probably have to share something different. Let's share this. And this worked for me earlier. There we go. So I want you to confirm that you can hear this. Can everybody hear this?
Everybody, I'm Robin Carnahan, and I lead a federal agency called the U.S. General Services Administration. We're in charge of one of the largest real estate portfolios in the country, as well as one of the largest fleets of vehicles. And we also help the federal government buy over $80 billion worth of goods and services every year. Now, I recently met two amazing Girl Scout troops from Wisconsin at the Green Build Conference in San Francisco. They were there to talk about why buying low embodied carbon material is so important. I've asked the Girl Scouts to share the things all of us should know about embodied carbon. Take it away, ladies.
Buildings are responsible for a lot of carbon emissions, but that means that every building is an opportunity to help the climate.
About half of the carbon emissions related to buildings actually comes from embodied carbon, the upfront carbon footprint of building materials.
Because we use such large amounts of building materials,
even small reductions in their embodied carbon makes a big difference.
by changing the recipe or manufacturing process, many materials can be made with lower embodied carbon.
Concrete can even sequester waste CO2 from industry, and plant-based materials, such as mass timber, sequester carbon naturally.
That means there's a big range in what makes a material low carbon.
So how can you choose?
Using life cycle analysis and environmental product declarations, or EPDs, can help you identify the greenest options.
Each project's a chance to make buildings green.
Remember, materials matter.
You can take action to reduce embodied carbon.
Help us spread the word.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scouts. It's great news that all across the country, people are finally starting to better understand the importance of taking action to reduce embodied carbon. And the federal government, well, we're ready to lead by example. Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. And that gave GSA the ability to invest over $2 billion to buy more low embodied carbon materials to use in our buildings. So stay tuned. And thanks again to these Girl Scout troops for showing us how to talk about embodied carbon and why it's so important for the health of our planet and our people.
Okay, so hopefully you all heard that. I didn't hear any complaints, so this group, it turns out that the person who leads this troop, her name is Julia Pooler. She, as I said, she is a mom and a Girl Scout troop leader, but she's actually a very smart person, I will tell you. She knows a lot more about this subject than I do. And she's learned it ever since the beginning of COVID, as a result of her and her troops' work with this embodied carbon issue. And in fact, she actually, I've helped her, but really she's the driving force behind what is titled here, the Wisconsin Municipal Embodied Carbon Reduction Initiative. Okay, this is actually something really of her, I'll say her design. And it's actually not so much a policy as it is a process. And the objective behind the process is, first of all, to encourage embodied carbon reduction. So really looking not just at concrete. Concrete is a large source of embodied carbon, but it's certainly not the only one. You know that municipalities around the state all have purchasing groups, and they can take embodied carbon into consideration when they're buying various things that they use. So at the municipal level, this is one of the things that interested me, because Citizens Climate Lobby works at the federal level, and it's at the federal level that working at the federal level is very difficult. A lot of impediments in your way. Much less so at the municipal level. So, at least from my perspective, it's an area or a place where you can get some things done really quickly that make you feel good about progress that you're making. What Julia really wants to do is to establish the capacity and knowledge base at the municipal level or at lower levels of government to make progress. And boy, let's see if I can get this to show here. I had to build this slide, and it didn't fit very well. And then build collaboration. Okay, so collaboration among municipalities around, in particular, for Wisconsin, around the state. Okay, so she's actually described a whole bunch of different elements of this initiative, and we've actually taken this initiative to a couple of towns, and I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. But we've taken this to a couple of towns around Madison, and we'll soon do it in Madison as well. Okay, so that's one of the things that's being done, and it all has to do with lowering embodied carbon in products. But it turns out that we're talking about concrete here, and so another thing that's going on right now is what I'll describe as LECLA laws. Okay, and LECLA is an acronym which stands for Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act. The first one of these was introduced in New Jersey, and it was actually passed. It was a bipartisan bill. What it does is to provide for money to get behind, I'll say, small startups who are looking into producing alternatives to Portland cement. Okay, and so there's a certain amount of money that's available really for any project to use to offset the added cost of a technology that will avoid some of the carbon dioxide that's emitted in producing some of the product or some of the materials that are being used on the project, and in this case, related to concrete. So there are several of these. The first one, as I mentioned, was in New Jersey. It was passed. There's another in New York, and there are several others that are being pursued around the country. There is another act called the CURB Act in Illinois, similar in concept, that is providing for some money, again, to support the development of these alternatives and really provide for the opportunity for these small startups to test out their products. Okay, there was actually, I believe that this Marin County effort was probably the first of its kind in the country in which the building code was actually changed to encourage the use of low embodied carbon concrete. And it specifies low embodied carbon concrete in some applications and determines, what properties need to be incorporated. And I mentioned also that here in and around Madison, we've been talking to municipalities about this very issue. And so we actually, I, along with Julia Pooler and another CCLer, Dick Smith, approached Middleton to get them interested in this, and they are very interested in it. In fact, they have a purchasing director there who is trying to establish a new purchasing policy, which includes an embodied carbon specification in the purchasing requirements. And this happens to be a recent note that I got from Kelly Hilliard, who is the purchasing director in Middleton, city of Middleton, as to an update on where they are, where they're at. We actually spoke with Kelly back in, I'm going to say it was like April, and you get into summer and people go away for the summer, and so it's literally taken this long to get things rolling. So even at the municipal level, things happen slowly. To Richard's point earlier, as much as we certainly in this group think that we need to do something about this quickly, it still happens slowly. And one of the things that certainly I've learned from this interaction at the municipal level is the importance of, first of all, cost, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. It's important that, at least from what I can hear, that the cost of any alternative has to be comparable to Portland cement. Okay, the concrete that you bruise has to be comparable to what we can produce and use today. And that's because budgets are involved. And I can tell you that every person that I've talked to at the municipal level has mentioned this to us, that, hey, bottom line, we all want to do this, but we've got to work within our budget. Okay. And at the municipal level, that's extremely important. And so it's something that I know I'm really sensitized to. I'm a cheapskate at heart, but so are a lot of other people. Another issue is this issue of early strength, being able to put something down on the ground and be able to put weight on it relatively quickly. One of the things that I guess I have recognized from this work is that's one of the reasons that asphalt is used instead of concrete on highways, I think, because you can put asphalt down, roll it, and put weight on it very quickly. Whereas concrete, if you were to pour concrete to replace a section of highway, you might have to wait a week before you could actually put highway traffic on it, in particular, bigger trucks. So because of that time that it takes for concrete to develop its ultimate strength. So that early strength is an important component or important property of any material that you develop to replace or supplement concrete or Portland cement. So one of the things that I had wanted to do was I wanted to understand what a good conceptual embodied carbon policy might be. So this is actually my idea, and it's actually based on everything that I've read and learned from people like Julia Pooler. In fact, this is essentially, I think, what she's included in that document that she produced and we presented to Kelly Hilliard in Middleton. So the first thing that's important is that we be able to use performance-based specifications. Why is that important? It turns out that concrete, because it's been used for so many, not just years or decades, but centuries now, it has an enormous amount of experience behind it. And so the formulations that are used that are specified in building codes are actually recipes as opposed to performance requirements. So when a building foundation is being poured, it will be specified as to what the concrete should contain, as opposed to what its compressive strength needs to be, or what the slump test needs to produce, or something like that. And the problem with that is that once you've specified the recipe or the formulation, substituting for it becomes impossible. You can't substitute for it because it's specified in the building code. And so these small companies who are developing alternatives have done is that they have done a lot of the research now to determine that the materials that they're substituting achieve the same properties that Portland cement-based concrete achieve. And so it's important that in the future we use performance-based specifications if we are to substitute for ordinary Portland cement and eliminate some of this carbon dioxide that we're emitting. The second thing in this policy should be avoid over-design. Turns out that concrete, when it's poured, can achieve up to a compressive strength of, let's say 5,000 to 10,000 pounds per square inch. Well, you really don't need that in particular on a sidewalk. And the way to avoid that is actually just simply include less Portland cement in your concrete. You just don't need as much. And by using less, it kind of makes sense because it's cheaper and it emits less carbon dioxide because it's the production of that Portland cement that emits most of the carbon dioxide that's going into the air in the case of concrete. So actually lowering the amount of Portland cement in, for example, sidewalk grade concrete can actually lower the carbon footprint of concrete all by itself. Just makes a lot of sense. The reason it's not done is because of liability. Okay, so there's a concern that, oh, if you do this, if you don't follow the current building code requirements that specify a particular mixture, then you expose yourself to liability if perhaps there's a crack in the concrete and you blame it on the fact that you didn't follow the exact recipe. So avoiding that over design is an important element in, at least in my opinion, in a good conceptual embodied carbon policy. The next is requiring verified environmental product declarations. And an environmental product declaration actually includes in it the amount of the amount of CO2 that was emitted in producing that product. Okay, among other things. It has a whole bunch of information in it, but one of the things that it has in it is this global warming potential that I mentioned in this next line. And the global warming potential is essentially just the effective amount of CO2 that was produced or that was emitted in producing that product, that unit of, or 1 unit of that product. Okay, and you want a verified one because a lot of people are producing these things right now, or are creating these environmental product declarations, but they're pulling them out of thin air, so-called out of whole cloth, without verifying them. It's my opinion, at least, that if you require everybody to provide these and you incorporate them into a purchasing policy, that the industry will, at least in part, police itself, because it will become a source of competitive advantage. And different producers will argue that another producer is really not accomplishing what they are claiming in their EPD, or their environmental product declaration. Finally, and this is, for me, this is kind of the key, is that when you're buying something, you minimize, what you do is you multiply that global warming potential by a carbon price. And you know that I work with Citizens Climate Lobby, so I'm always looking for an opportunity to use a carbon price. If you multiply these two things together, they will give you the essentially the climate cost of that product. And you can add that then to the unit price of the material. And that would then reflect sort of the actual cost of that material. Okay, both the what I would call the public cost, as well as the hidden cost of using that particular product. And in the case of concrete, this is particularly important because there, various types of concrete would have a different global warming potential depending on how, whether, or how much, first of all, how much Portland cement is included in it, and second, whether alternatives were included that actually lower the the amount of CO2 generated in producing that cement. Okay, and so the actual formula for doing that is down here. I won't go into all the gory details of that. But one interesting thing about this to me was that I struggled with this when I first got involved in this whole issue, trying to figure out, well, what should policy really be? Because Citizens Climate Lobby is all about policy. I mean, we've been pursuing carbon pricing for years now, for a decade, more than a decade. And it's really the thing that holds the organization together. And I was going to work on this, and I just didn't know what the policy should be. And so I finally came to the conclusion that it's really this simple. It's this simple little equation right here that happens to include a carbon price. And I showed this to another friend of mine in Citizens Climate Lobby, and they challenged me. They said, "Where'd you get that thing from?" And I said, "Well, I just worked it out myself. It's sort of kind of engineering principles that this is what you should do." He said, "Well, that'll never fly. You don't have any credibility anywhere other than in your own house, and you have very little there. So you need to find this. You need to find somebody who has proposed this, somebody, on a campus or some public official, somebody famous, whatever, who's proposed this, who will, get behind you. And I find this certainly frustrating that what I would, and I guess this is just generally true, that what some people find to be obvious isn't necessarily obvious to other people. And so you have to develop that credibility one way or another. And in the meantime, you will be frustrated. So, okay, so what are some of the solutions? So that was policy. What are some of the solutions that people are looking at? So in the past, I talked about really a whole bunch of alternatives to using concrete itself. Using microsilica is one of these things. I mentioned earlier that actually the smelting process in producing steel is similar to producing lime, in that the way you smelt iron is you add carbon at a very high temperature to iron, essentially iron oxide. And what happens is that the carbon, the coke that you add to that oven, essentially reacts with the oxygen that's in the iron oxide and purifies the iron at high temperature. But you end up producing a lot of CO2 in the smelting process. Well, actually, the process of making steel results in some byproducts that actually can be used in producing concrete as well. And so that those byproducts from the steel making process can actually be substituted for Portland cement, and actually result in less expensive concrete as well as stronger concrete, because these fine powders, as I mentioned earlier, they fill in the pores that would otherwise be in concrete. And so by filling in the pores now, the compressive strength is increased, because now you have something to press against when something sits on top of the concrete. Okay, so it strengthens the concrete. Concrete debris. We see this a lot now. People are deconstructing old buildings, right? I know on campus, I always joke that I ride my bike around and supervise all the projects going on campus. And I've seen a lot of buildings come down in the last, 5-10 years. And in general, the first step of building a new building is tearing down an old one. And you always see this pile of rubble right next to the site where the old building has been brought down, crumbled up. And a lot of this stuff will end up in subsequent concrete because it has all of those minerals that we were looking at earlier that form concrete. Now, most of this will actually be used as the aggregate, but if you grind this stuff up, it's got all those minerals in it that we need to make cement. Post-consumer glass, okay, is another thing that's used. Again, glass is quartz. It's a bunch of silica, so it's got the right minerals in it, right, to make cement. And in fact, in some cases, what they do is they leave the air in these things. It just takes up space, and in some structures, that air that's left in the form ultimately improves the performance of what you're building by insulating. This is something that I actually presented the last time I did this or hit this subject. It's really what got me involved in this in learning more about this to begin with. And this is something that that professors at the University of Wisconsin are working on right now. Essentially, what they're doing is they're taking fly ash, and if you fly ash, the composition of fly ash is calcium, silica, alumina, and iron. And all of those elements that you find in Portland cement, just not necessarily in the right proportions, but there's a lot of calcium and certainly a lot of silica that was in the original coal that was burned in power plants. And so all that stuff goes up the stack. It actually gets, it used to just go up the stack and get blown out the top and would float down on top of people's cars a long time ago until they started precipitating it out at the tops of the stacks. And when they did that, they would slurry it over to someplace and accumulate it. And these fly ash, I call them fly ash ponds because they were originally created with a slurry. They dry out over a long period of time and then just become, recovered land. And certainly where I first started working, we had big fly ash ponds right next to the buildings where I worked. And we used to play softball on the softball fields that were built on top of these old fly ash ponds. One of the problems with fly ash ponds is that in addition to the silica and the calcium and the iron and the alumina, there are also potentially a bunch of heavy metals that are included in that. And these heavy metals can be leached out over time and end up down in the water table, in particular in drinking water. And so when this was learned, I don't know exactly when, they started to line these ponds to prevent that leaching from occurring. But not all fly ash ponds in the U.S. and certainly not around the world have been lined. So this continues to be a problem. And in fact, in some cases, you may have heard about this, and I think it's in the Tennessee Valley, where obviously a lot of electricity has been produced. Several years ago, I think a dam broke or something like that, and water flowed over one of these fly ash areas, ponds, and this stuff ended up flowing downriver and contaminated quite a bit of area. It was, I believe that Duke Power was the utility involved, as I remember. This is just kind of vaguely in my memory right now. So this is an issue. It's an issue around the country. This fly ash sits in places all over the country just simply because we burned a lot of coal over the years to generate electricity. And, you know, I'm not arguing about that. And we burned it for good reason at the time. But we've created an environmental issue that actually, in some cases, needs to be cleaned up. And this stuff is sitting around. It's not being used otherwise. And at least in my opinion, it has almost zero value. But actually, what's being produced today in coal-fired plants that continue to operate, the fly ash that's being produced there is actually being captured and then sent to concrete manufacturers because they include it in the concrete they're producing, and it improves properties. In fact, some specifications for interstate highways require a certain amount of fly ash to be included, and that fly ash substitutes for Portland cement, and in doing that, it avoids all that CO2 that's produced otherwise. So it turns out that you can activate fly ash using an alkali. You have to add some calcium hydroxide to it, or lime, and then hydrate it. Hydrate the lime in order to form the calcium hydroxide, and in doing that, cause the fly ash to effectively become this cement paste and substitute for Portland cement. And so that's more or less the idea that's being pursued by these professors at UW. But in addition to that, if you blow air, and this is what Lou was talking about earlier, if you essentially bubble air through that fly ash, it will absorb CO2 and form calcium carbonate, and you've got excess. You have excess calcium hydroxide in there, and so that calcium hydroxide will convert to calcium carbonate, and you'll end up with actually even stronger concrete as a result of that. And that's what these guys are doing. They're taking a fly ash pond, that they've ended up talking to, I think, somebody down in Georgia about using their fly ash for whatever reason. And so they're taking that and they are essentially bubbling ambient air through it. It's absorbing the CO2 in the air and carbonating the calcium. And then they then add that into the concrete mixture that is that's being mixed up in a ready mix plant locally. And so there are lots of nice features, lots of nice really business features about this that I particularly like. I've looked at a lot of these little companies that are doing this, and I guess I could be biased because I went to school here and I live here, but I actually believe that this is one of the best ideas that I've personally seen. But whether they're successful ultimately is really up to them. I have no financial interest or any. I just have a climate interest in their success, I guess. So they patented this. This is the diagram that came from their patent literature. It talks about what they're doing, but ultimately what they do depends on how the process develops. But I know that right now they are getting ready to produce trial quantities of this, either here in Madison or perhaps down in Middleton. And as I said, I think they have a site picked out for where they would set up a pilot facility right now. Kind of interesting. So there actually are a number of other companies that are pursuing this right now. I mentioned that the old concrete, can be used for this. This is an article that talks about, what people are doing to recycle old concrete. Effectively, they are taking old concrete and they're grinding it up, and that exposes all of that silica and calcium and alumina, and that's sitting in the old concrete, and makes it available for producing cement again. There's a company called Sublime, kind of a clever name. This is a reference to their website, and actually they're kind of interesting to me because what they claim they can do is produce calcium oxide electrolytically. So they will take something potentially they will take something other than calcium carbonate and put it into an electrolytic cell and drive off the anion from the calcium and form calcium oxide without producing carbon dioxide. Or they can do this in a cell, in the same cell with calcium carbonate, and drive off CO2, but capture the CO2 directly because it's in a more pure form. But then they still have to figure out what to do with it, what to do with that CO2, and that's oftentimes the Achilles heel of these processes, because they're really, actually there are a bunch of these companies who claim that they're doing this, and their objective with the CO2 is to sell it to, for example, gas well operators who jam it down their gas wells in order to improve the output of the gas fields. Well, that actually would be a great idea, obviously, if it wasn't for the fact that you're producing methane, which either by itself would be a greenhouse gas, or when you burn it, forms more CO2. So you're really not necessarily solving the problem that at least I want to solve. So I'm not as interested in solutions like this. I've been presented with them before, and kind of expressed my disinterest, I guess. There's also an alliance, this Decarbonized Cement Alliance, okay? And they're an alliance of all of these companies that are involved in creating alternatives. I will say there are, oh boy, somewhere between 10 and 20 different companies involved here. And I mentioned earlier, go back up to this slide here real quick. Requiring verified environmental product declarations, these EPDs, okay? And I say that's got to be part of a conceptual embodied carbon policy. Well, one of the problems with a lot of these guys is that they're making claims right now that they can reduce the amount of CO2 in the concrete they produce or the cement that they produce, but they can't necessarily verify it. And there are organizations or organizations who, like Underwriters Laboratory, who will verify whether your environmental product declaration is legitimate. And that's one of the things that likely will happen as a result of this, that somebody or some set of regulatory bodies of some sort will verify these environmental product declarations, because some of these companies really aren't accomplishing what they say they are. Well, this is an example of that. This company called Forterra, where they're producing something, but they actually, in order to produce their product, they have to use calcium oxide, which is also called quicklime. Well, the way you make quicklime is you drive CO2 off of calcium carbonate. So, you know, the question is, are you really reducing the amount of CO2 or not? Whereas this process up here, the objective here is actually to capture enough CO2 from the air to offset anything that you've included already. You know, so there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of calcium hydroxide that's left over in the cement when you're done hydrating it. And there's and in fact, concrete itself will absorb CO2 over its lifetime, and that's the reason why that reaction is taking place. So as a summary, this was a summary of the different strategies that are being taken by different companies to address the CO2 issue. So in some cases, these guys are going after point source CO2 injected into concrete. So, for example, if you're at a utility that is, you know, burning gas or coal, then what's going up the stack is a fairly concentrated stream of CO2 and water, and you can use that concentrated stream to interact with, say, concrete, and you can absorb a lot of that CO2 and convert it into calcium carbonate. And so there are companies that are, well, this is a list of them right here. Solidia, Carbon Built, Carbicrete, Carbon Cure. Carbon Cure is an outfit that I'm more familiar with. They do this ready mix concrete, which is, boy, a lot of concrete is distributed that way, right? So that's really where you want to provide your product. But a lot of these guys are actually sort of, because they're at a point source, they like to use whatever product they're making at that source. And so they're making something like building or cinder blocks, for example, right there at that plant, because they have a lot of the material there. Another alternative is removing the CO2 after the cement product production. Okay, so you know you're driving CO2 off when you're producing Portland cement, so you can capture it right there and mineralize it. Okay. And so there's a company called Heidelberg that's doing that. Then there are people who are going after different manufacturing processes. Okay, so I mentioned Sublime. They use renewable energy, and they use something less carbon intensive for cement. They're using renewable energy, actually. So, you know, I told you that they're using an electrolytic cell to do this, and they are also tying that into. In fact, I believe they have I think they're locating their facilities right next to a lot of solar power. Here, this Brimstone company is using calcium silicate rock as opposed to calcium carbonate, so that when you do the separation, you don't get CO2 emitted. Okay, so there are different descriptions of these different companies and what they're trying to accomplish. But in any case, they're all trying to produce a material using a different manufacturing process to avoid that CO2. And then there's a fourth method, low negative carbon aggregates that they add to concrete. And these guys are using point source CO2, and they need very low cost operations. And so one of the problems with a lot of these guys is that the cost of what they're doing is relatively high, so that they're creating an additive to a concrete mixture that makes the concrete ultimately more expensive. And I just personally think that from a success standpoint, they have a lower probability of success because of that. Mainly, and I base that based on conversations, as I said, I've had with municipalities where they're so cost conscious, they're so price conscious here, because of budgets. And then finally, this SCM stands for supplementary cementitious materials to reduce cement content. Okay, and actually, this is sort of what they're pursuing at UW. So they're doing this with other substrates, let's call them, like fly ash. But you can use really anything that includes those minerals that we talked about in the original chemistry slides. Where's their real progress? So it turns out that in Portland, and this was something that I got really excited about, in Portland, I could show you this video, but I'm not going to take up the time right now. In Portland, they decided to conduct an experiment. And in particular, they were interested if reducing the amount of Portland cement in their sidewalk mixture would have any impact on the performance of the sidewalks that they poured. And also whether it would make a difference to the construction workers, or the guys who are forming and pouring the concrete, pouring the sidewalks. And so they actually really conducted an experiment in the city where they took on the liability risk to I think they poured, oh boy, I'm going to say 5 different blends or something like that. And included among them was one of these very low embodied carbon admixtures to lower the carbon footprint of the concrete. And they found that they were successful in all 5 cases. They ended up with properties that met requirements, or at least met requirements, if not more so. And in fact, one of the conclusions of the experiment, or experiments, was that they could lower the Portland cement content even more, because they required, I think it was something like 3,000 psi ultimate strength, and they were getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 6,000 when they were done. And clearly that's more than that they needed for sidewalks. And so they could be even let's say greener than they demonstrated in their experiments. And I was very excited about this because I thought, well, Portland has done the heavy lifting for the rest of the country. You know, they've taken the risk, the financial risk, the liability risk, you know, in doing this experiment and demonstrated that it's really not an issue. And I presented this, you know, in and around Madison, and the immediate concern is that, well, the environment is different. You know, we're colder here in Wisconsin than in Portland. The weather is different, and so the performance might be different. And so we'll have to conduct the experiments here as well. So, you know, it's a little frustrating for me, but in spite of that, it makes sense, because, you know, ultimately liability will be one of the impediments to getting this implemented, at least in my opinion, for what that's worth. There is another project that's going on that actually other people within Citizens Climate Lobby have gotten involved, and that's this big Denver sidewalk project. They have an objective over the next, boy, it's like 20 years of replacing, I'll say, every inch of sidewalk in and around Denver. So there's a lot of sidewalk that has to be poured. And we're trying to get a policy put in place that requires low embodied carbon concrete to be used. So that's something that's actually underway right now, you know, something that's very likely to happen. And finally, Middleton. You know, I mentioned earlier that Middleton is actually pursuing this policy. I believe that sometime this fall, if not by the end of the year, they will have a new purchasing policy in place that encourages the use of really low embodied carbon everything, not just concrete, but really anything. And you know, the only question will be, you know, what the language will actually be. What else do I have here? So, you know, what is actually the impact of all of this? So these were some, or I'll call them more or less back of the envelope calculations that I did really a couple of years ago. So using these alkaline industrial wastes that we're talking about, using something like fly ash as opposed to Portland cement, it's actually, at least from what I've read in research papers, you can go to very high fly ash content and still get the properties that you need. You can still get compressive strength. You can still get relatively early strength in the poured concrete to meet the requirements. Again, you know, we need performance-based requirements, and that's something that don't exist right. Those things don't exist right now. But if you were to be able to do that, then Portland cement produces about 0.9 pounds of CO2 per pound of cement. And the annual worldwide production of Portland cement is about 4 billion metric tons. So you could potentially decrease, if you know, in the extreme, you could decrease annual CO2 emissions by 3.6 billion metric tons. That's a lot. And so the you know, the point of this is that by simply addressing the concrete issue, not all of the embodied carbon issue, you know, this is the potential. And when I ran this into En-ROADS, which is a simulation that you know, allows you to sort of play around with the effect of changing various policies and the effect on the climate and the warming potential of those different changes. En-ROADS implied that you know, I could lower the ultimate temperature rise to, like, I think it was like 1.8 degrees centigrade, something like that. Then there's this issue of cost, and I've mentioned this before, that, and at least I believe that being able to match Portland cement cost is very important. And I think that that can be accomplished, in particular using fly ash, because fly ash that's just sitting around really might be available for as little as $0 per ton. In fact, it's possible that some utilities, because they have to remediate, might even pay you to take it away. I don't know that, but you know, it's possible. There's also a Inflation Reduction Act subsidy, which is at about $30 a ton. There's this, I mentioned LECLA. Remember the policy that's out there around LECLA. There's money available there. So I believe that the net cost of this alternative could be extremely low, and it actually ultimately might even compete with asphalt, because asphalt is, you know, clearly it's used much more extensively than concrete nowadays, and in part that's because it's much cheaper, and there's a lot of opportunity to use concrete as an alternative to asphalt, and concrete will sequester carbon dioxide. Okay, so that's kind of the end of what I have right now. I see that I just saw a hand rise, and so I would imagine that, you know, any of you guys can speak up whenever you want to.
Doug,
Yeah.
one of the things, and I think I probably learned this during or as a consequence of one of your earlier talks on cement, I thought that they were still finding out and not completely understanding, for instance, how Roman concrete has lasted so long, and that the fact that we don't fully understand all the processes that cause really long-lived concrete, that there's an increasing reluctance to tamper at all with the recipe. And I wonder, I could see the sidewalks, and even in Wisconsin, I would be reluctant for them to take Portland, Oregon results and apply them to our sidewalks without further testing, just because of the change in environment, the amount of rain we get. Maybe we'll get more rain and we'll get more crevices with the freezing and thawing. I just see this, it's a big potential for solving environmental problems, but it's also a big problem for instability in structures that might be built.
And you know, and you know, you're the source of my frustration. I'm just joking.
Okay.
So now, no, with regard to what's known about concrete, oh boy, cement that was produced back in Roman times, I believe that there is. I'm not an expert on this, so I really I caution you not to believe most of what I'm about to tell you, but my understanding, at least, is that the material that was used in Roman times really was for the most part volcanic ash. And volcanic ash has all of these minerals that we're talking about right now and more, and perhaps in different proportions as well. So I'm reasonably confident, at least for myself, that contributes to why it's hung around as long as it has. It isn't that it hasn't had its own problems. I mean, you look at the I don't know, hey, the Roman Forum is not standing anymore. So there are probably several reasons for that, but the Colosseum still is standing, but it doesn't look so great.
I thought the viaducts and aqueducts have lasted a really long time.
Sure, and they absolutely have, but they aren't carrying water around and all that anymore either. So I'm just saying that you're right. And as I said, I'm not an expert on this. So if to get a really good answer, one that you can really hang your hat on, I would talk to actually one of the guys that I've been conversing with at the university, because they actually know a lot more about concrete than I do, and they're aware of probably some of the research that's gone into investigating why this is and that sort of thing. But with respect to comparing, say, Portland with Madison, it's absolutely legitimate to be concerned about liability. I mean, I have a business degree. I'm really aware of that. Hey, that's money out of your pocket if somebody sues you for something that you should have been aware of otherwise. It was disappointing to me that people weren't more excited about, oh, well, they were able to do this in Portland, so they've established what an experimental procedure. What they did was really pretty simple. They just poured a few sidewalk sections and then observed how they performed over a year or two. Did they have any of the problems that they would have expected otherwise? And more importantly, did they, what was the compressive strength that they developed early on, as well as after a month? That was a risk that they took that can easily be taken by other municipalities. So and then on this, and anybody who talks about this will tell you that there are more or less risky applications that you can pursue. So, sidewalks are arguably one of the least risky, because the consequence of a sidewalk failing isn't, it's financial because you have to replace the sidewalk. But, a crack in the sidewalk isn't, people aren't going to die from a crack in the sidewalk, whereas a crack in an 80-story building, that's a different story. So, that's why, the tests, really the first applications will be in these, what they call, what I've learned, they call flat work, where you're pouring roads or sidewalks or something like that.
So Lou, or Doug?
Yeah.
I've got just a name question. So the term Portland, it tends to be used with a capital P, but it seems to be, is it really more of a generic? And maybe in the beginning it was some patented formula. What is, how worldwide, is that term Portland have some specific meaning, or is this just kind of a general name for when you add glue to cement that isn't what,
No, you can Google this yourself. I did it for the same reason that you did, because I'm a curious guy.
I Googled you. That's easier.
No, you can Google Portland cement. You can look for the origins of it. I believe it was developed in like Great Britain or something, a town called Portland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's true. My brain might be fooling me right now, but I think that's true. But you can, like I said, you can Google it really quickly.
But it's just used broadly, basically with a lowercase p. It's not some trademarked name, is it?
No, no, it's not I don't think it's a trademark name. It's just from what I know, it's the common name given to this material.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Anytime you're using kind of a glue mixture in contrast to some of these other alternatives.
Well, Portland cement is a particular, well, I'm going to say it like a particular way of making it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And but you know, there are all these, you know, and if you get into this, you'll learn this. There are all these what are called SCMs, or supplementary cementitious materials.
Yeah, why not?
And I hate using acronyms because I can't remember them, you know, unless but you know, then you start talking to people who do this a lot, and boy, you know, it's alphabet soup.
Okay.
You know, it's just one of those things. But Portland cement is typically it's made in large quantities. It's shipped around the world, you know, by big companies. Big companies are into it, and in fact, I would fully expect that if, you know, some of these guys who are, you know, getting into these alternative materials, if they become very successful, you know, there's going to be big resistance from these big cement manufacturers because they've got a lot of money invested in this, right?
Sure. Sure.
So I would
All
fully
right.
expect that.
Yeah, but you definitely demonstrated how complex this whole topic is with this presentation. That's one intense amount of information. Thanks, Doug.
Well,
Right.
you know, like I said, I remember when I first presented this, I did not understand all the chemistry that well, and I won't say that I fully understand it now either, but I understand it a lot better now, and actually being able to understand it allows you then to talk to people who are working in this area, who they may be doing things, and it ultimately it may appear that they're pulling the wool over your eyes too. So anyway.
Doug, it's Richard. I have one last question in the few minutes we have. You said you would give us a quickie update on heat pumps. What are your thoughts compared to 10 years ago? What's happened in this, particularly in this latitude, that allows them to be more reasonably considered?
Yeah, so we and I think I mentioned this I thought maybe I gave a presentation about this, but maybe I didn't.
Yeah, I just want an update, that's all.
Yeah, so we installed our heat pump up north now. Well, we ran it all last year, I will tell you that. Ran it all last year. And actually I could even tell you, if I had a few minutes, I could look up what it actually cost.
Off the top of your head.
Yeah, so we ran it all last winter, and instead of using, I will say, probably about 1,200 gallons of propane to heat our place up north, and just to keep it, you know, at 50 or above for most of the winter, except for the few times when we're up there a week or so at a time. We would use, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 gallons of propane. This year we used about 300.
Okay, that's
and then we used the heat pump for everything else up north. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of, you know, how much, you know, how efficient the thing is. Okay.
Did you have the heat pump on just when you were up there for?
No, it runs all the time.
Okay.
And I will tell you that in addition to that, our hot water heater here in Madison failed last January. And I personally installed a heat pump water heater here in Madison. And you may know, some of you guys may have one of these things. If you install it in your basement, it acts as a dehumidifier.
Yeah.
And in my lifetime, I will say that in any period of 10 years, if you have a dehumidifier, you're going to install or you're going to buy 5 dehumidifiers because they last about 2 years. They work fine for the first year, but after the second year, you turn them on and there's nothing coming out of them because all of the refrigerant is leaked out.
Yeah.
And then you're into, you're either buying another one or, I mean, I happen to know how to, put refrigerant back into the dehumidifier. Well, this heat pump water heater doubles as a basement dehumidifier. And so this past summer, our base, I have an old dehumidifier down there that, I've been babying along for several years. I didn't even bother turning it on this summer.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another quick question before we're done. I would like to know how much electricity you used to have that heat pump on all winter long. Did you?
Okay, so I have to look it up.
Okay. Well, you can let us know.
And I will send you an email.
Okay, thank you. And I'll forward that.
I have a question. How much did that heat pump water heater cost you? And
I believe, and I can look it up, but I believe it was something like $1,200.
Yeah, because I'm hearing outrageous prices, but I never. And where did you get it?
I actually bought it at Menards.
Huh.
And I'll just tell you a little bit about it. So prior to that, we had a gas-fired methane,
of course,
natural gas-fired water heater. And so there was no electricity going to it. And it turned out there in the room where it was, there was no floor drain. So when you install one of these things, you need electricity, and you no longer need the gas. So I capped that off. That was pretty simple to do. And then I just put in a 240 volt
breaker.
30 amp breaker, which is really pretty, if you can do it yourself, then you can. Otherwise, you have to pay an electrician to do it. And I ran 25 feet of number 10 wire over to the thing.
Okay.
And the only other trick that because I didn't have a floor drain, it turned out that I did have a clean out in that room, which I opened up and I put a stack in there, and I ran because the heat pump, it's going to condense because it's acting as a dehumidifier. It's going to condense water from the air. You've got to do something with that water. And so I just ran a piece of PVC tubing over to that stack, and it drops into the stack and solve that problem too.
They do sell a 120 volt water
you can get a 120 volt one as well, but then you have to have a much higher, you're going to pull more amps, and that's all. And I will say to you that since I started that thing up, actually the electricity going to it is going to the first of all, it has the heat pump, the heat pump element of it, which sits on top of the water heater.
Right.
It also has resistant heat backup. Okay. And so that's why you need generally you need the 240 volts. If you don't care about the backup, you don't need 240 volts, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it'd be an easier install.
But I will tell you that since I've started that thing up, the resistance heat has not been used.
That's good. That's really
It's
good.
actually interesting that they recommend this so-called eco mode to run this thing in. And the eco mode would use either the heat pump or the resistance heat. But you can set it to use heat pump only. And for me personally, and other people who are online, they're scratching their heads as to why they call the dual mode the eco mode. But you know, I honestly don't know why they do that. But we certainly have not needed to use the resistance backup. Now, again, my biggest concern with this is one of reliability. I don't know how long this thing will run before it starts to leak refrigerant.
Oh, yeah. Well,
that's actually my biggest concern.
Yeah,
And it's an unknown to me personally.
But that's a great thing that you did that. They work really well in utility rooms where you have a furnace next to it.
Exactly, and that's exactly where ours is.
Heat. They can take that
but you know,
in
the summertime, it cools the basement. You know, so.
Yeah, it's true too. Okay, well, maybe they're together.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your talk today, Doug, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. And
I'll send you. I'll look this other information up real quick, Lynn, and I'll send it to you, Richard.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Right along. We have for next week. We have Ryan Pickering is going to talk to us. I think, on new nuclear plants. Ryan is a real enthusiast, and I think we'll find he will pick some interesting things that we don't hear about very often. So I'm looking forward to that. And meanwhile, I hope you all have a great week, and thanks again, Doug.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.